The 16th century had a large growth aspect to um, the colonial period and population in general overall. We talked about the establishment of the colonies and how they were founded under charter or any other reason. But how were they populated? You had your initial settlers who came to the Chesapeake region, and then, of course, up to New England. We talked about those and the various different communities that would exist in the South. But a large percentage of people coming to the colonies in the mid 1600s were indentured servants. And that was partially needed because of lack of opportunity and oppression for a number of people back home in England who were seeking new opportunities. Oftentimes, a poor Englishman might be offered an opportunity to go over to English North America as a colonist and be offered a contract of service for a specified amount of time for whatever reason. And in that contract, and we talked about this in the last chapter, but a little more detail now. In that contract, there would be a specified amount of time, typically between 5 to 7 years, where an indentured servant would work for somebody, some sort of labor, whether it's manual, industrial, artisan, or otherwise, and they would receive lodging, food, that sort of a thing. Said nothing about how they could be treated, because many, if not most, indentured servants were quite brutally abused, physically and otherwise, by their contractor, so to speak. So, from that standpoint, indentured servants also cost a little bit more. They're more expensive. And then, of course, as per the agreement, their servitude would end. So, even though indentured servants were promised various different resources upon the end of their indenture, that wouldn't necessarily guarantee opportunity. So you have many English settlers coming as a result of indentured servitude who would now be thrust into English North American colonial population with nothing. Maybe just the clothes on their back. Maybe 5 to 7 years worth of experience as a candle maker, as a print pressman, or as something of the sort. So what you started to see was a population of white English former indentures who would now be set free from their indenture, and they had nowhere to go, and they didn't have money. Yes, some indentured servants made lives in themselves as successful artisans, or maybe they were to develop a business, maybe they had a plot of land that they came across or something like that, maybe a generally lucky stroke. But the overwhelming majority of them did not have real opportunities. And this created social chaos in various different communities, especially in the Chesapeake region. So you had various different communities of indentured servants that would become somewhat of a social nuisance. They were rowdy. They were unclean. They had nowhere to go. They were somewhat destitute. That's not a good thing. And they're making demands that they want more. Okay. So if you need labor, and say, for example, you own a shop or maybe a farm or something along those lines, are you going to want indentured servants that you're going to have to pay more for and eventually set free and eventually maybe see them wreak havoc on colonial society? No. You're going to seek slave labor. And not only are slaves going to cost you less, but there's no contract. It is completely reasonable to expect that a slave could live their entire lives in slavery. Okay? So, from that standpoint, you have a majority of indentured servants coming over from England that are males. Eventually, there would be an influx of females, especially in various other different regions. But still, over 3/4 of all the indentured servants were males. Slaves would eventually become more preferred for those who needed labor. As I mentioned, they would cost less. They would serve as more of a permanent labor force. that sort of a thing. You had a ready-made population and market from West Africa to the Caribbean up into North America. Besides that, you have various different conditions back in England itself that started to improve from an economic standpoint, which reduced the need for people seeking opportunities across the Atlantic Ocean. So, the number of indentured servants would eventually start to wane, especially as slaves became more prevalent. So, that is something that became crucial around that time. The biggest population growth in the colonies, though, came by way of immigration. You have folks coming from England who would come to settle various different areas, especially in New England. And you had a substantial source of population growth because of the immigration. And if families were uprooting and colonizing and coming to immigrate, they were far more likely to come as a family, just as I mentioned, which means that they would likely have more traditional opportunities for birthing and other natural forms of growth. That was especially true in New England, where the population in the second half of the 16th century, or 17th century rather, almost quadrupled. It's largely because immigration became a lot bigger and families expanded. And because a lot of families in the New England region came there, you have more of a balance of sex ratio. So you have almost as many women as you would have males in that region. Okay, so the Chesapeake, which was predominantly male, over 4-to-1 ratio, especially in the early goings, would slowly but surely increase. Now, life expectancies were higher up north. That was another reason why New England populations grew fast. People lived unusually longer, given the era, up in New England than, say, in the Chesapeake. There are various different reasons for it. One may be a warmer and more humid and more laborious type climate in Virginia, where you have more farm labor and your indentured servants, your slaves, and your white settlers all toiling more, being more susceptible to malaria or other different aspects that are more physically draining, which would shorten their life expectancy. They would typically also have less of a family unit, and so they wouldn't have quite the support network. Whereas up north, you had longer livelihoods. You didn't have quite the labor-intensive agriculture up in New England that you would have down in the Chesapeake region. And you also had more families. And so that lent itself to a longer life expectancy, generally healthier lives. You would have more family units and a more balanced male-female ratio than you would down south in the Chesapeake. So those are some things that quite also benefited the birth and death rates for each. Now, as far as medicine goes, I mentioned a few minutes ago that folks in the Chesapeake region were very susceptible to malaria and other diseases that shortened life expectancy. We know today, through modern medical science and technology, various different things involved around sterilization. Of course, we live in the coronavirus era, so hopefully you're washing your hands and using hand sanitizer, using masks when appropriate and when guided, things along those lines. But if you've ever had surgery, or if you've ever been to the hospital, or even just a simple doctor's visit, they're very careful to use gloves and wash their hands thoroughly and get in the cracks of their fingers and all kinds of different things to make sure things are as sterile as possible. Because medicine in the 1600s in colonial English North America and in England and in Europe itself, medicine was still very primitive. Oftentimes they relied on centuries old beliefs dating back to even the Roman era, 1,000 or so, 1,400 years or so beforehand. They would believe in various different things that we know today to be ludicrous, but I don't know, 2,000 years ago that was deemed to have been the correct way to do things. One of which is called humorism, also known as bloodletting. The idea of humorism is that there is basically um, four different types of fluids in a person's body. You have bile, you have black bile, you have blood, and then you have phlegm. Sounds awesome, right? Yay, attractive. So, blood, phlegm, and the two biles. If you are out of balance, that is not a good thing. And if you are sick, it's because you're out of balance. So, the most likely opportunity for you to go back into balance if you are sick is to be bloodlet. They're going to bleed you out to restore your balance. Let me ask you this, folks. You watching the video, if you bleed out, what happens? If you had your blood level removed or even allowed yourself to bleed completely out, what happens? Do you go on and live a beautifully healthy life, now toxin free? No, you bleed out. You're going to die. Okay? Hopefully, I hope some of you watching this weren't really wondering, well, I wonder what happened if I bled out. I don't know. No, I hope that you guys understand that if you lose all your blood, you're going to die. Okay? But the prevailing mindset of the time under humorism is that you're out of balance. You need to be bloodlet to rid yourself of impurities and to restore the balance of fluids in your body. We know that to be ludicrous today. Okay? That's why you have all kinds of different blood drives and Carter Blood Care Center and different blood types and things like that. We're running low on AB or B type blood or whatnot. I'm O positive, by the way, so you're more likely to find stuff from me. We know blood is vital. Your heart cannot pump blood and oxygen all throughout your body if there is no blood. You can't carry nutrients and oxygen-rich aspects and cells all over. Healing, you can't let your body breathe without blood. You need healthy blood, okay? So we know today that bloodletting is not a good thing. Back then, in the 1600s, that was deemed as being appropriate. And that goes to show you just how primitive medicine was when they were relying on over 1,000-year-old ideas of improving one's health. Also around this time, the idea of midwifery became prevalent in English colonial North America. So a midwife is generally a woman who assists other women in birth, and they might also give other forms of medical advice and things along those lines. As noble as that is, oftentimes midwives did not know anything about sterilization. We talked about that a second ago. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about sterilizing equipment. So you had very high death rates for mothers who would become infected. Never mind, the actual infant itself might also become infected with various different things. When children are born nowadays, the medical staff there for the birth generally are handling very sterile equipment. They're wearing all kinds of masks and PPE to protect themselves. They cut the umbilical cord. They put in the silver iodine in the eyes to, disinfect the infant's eyes, things along those lines. And so there are all kinds of different things that we know in the 21st century that has drastically improved birth rates for infants and the health of mothers as well. Back then, midwives, as noble as they were, they didn't know a whole lot. A lot of women became midwives without substantial medical or health knowledge. And eventually, as medicine began to improve and science began to improve, typically not until the 19th century, they were deemed as accepted. Anybody could almost do it. Almost anybody, rather. Okay? But back then, those were the makeups of folks coming to English North America. Indentured servants, slavery would eventually be preferred, slaves maintaining their preferred status as laborers. Then you also had immigrants coming from primarily the British Isles themselves. And then, of course, medicine. Interesting times. Don't ever get bloodlet.